Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating territory today, obedience. Specifically, those famous Milgram experiments. We're going right to the source for this one, Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority.
We're going to get right into the nitty-gritty of what makes people tick and how much power authority really has over us.
All right, so imagine yourself back in the 1960s at Yale. You're part of the study on learning and memory. Simple enough, right? They put you in the teacher role and another participant, the learner, in a separate room.
Oh, yeah, and there's a twist. The learner's hooked up to what you think is a shock machine. Your job. Zap them every time they mess up. And get this, each wrong answer, the voltage goes up.
And here's the kicker, the learner. An actor, no real shocks involved, but you don't know that. You're hearing cries of pain. Please to stop as that voltage climbs.
Milgram wanted to know, how far would people go when someone in a lab coat, the authority figure, tells them to keep shocking, even when it's obviously hurting another person?
Yes. Before we get to the results, I'm curious. What do you think happened? Would people listen to their conscience? Or would they cave to that pressure from the authority figure?
Well, Milgram asked around psychiatrists, students, regular folks. Pretty much everyone agreed only a tiny, tiny percentage would go all the way to the highest voltage. I mean, who'd willingly inflict that kind of pain, right?
But the results tell a different story, don't they?
A much darker story. Almost 2/3 of people in that first experiment went all the way to what they thought was a deadly 450 volts. And these weren't like unusual people, just everyday folks from all walks of life.
That's mind-blowing. So why? Why did they obey? What was going on in their heads?
That's the million-dollar question that obsessed Milgram. He did interviews, analyzed everything. A big factor. The shocks started small and slowly increased. It's like a slippery slope, Once you've given a few shocks, it's harder to stop.
You kind of get desensitized to it?
Exactly. And there's this thing Milgram called binding factors. You feel obligated to the experiment, don't want to be rude by quitting. Plus, it's just plain awkward to back out. And then there's shifting the blame. It's easier to obey when you can tell yourself, hey, I'm just following orders.
It's like they narrow their focus, fixated on the task, they lose sight of the big picture.
Totally. In this case, they're so focused on the word pairs and those switches, the whole ethics of it gets lost. It's like tunnel vision. Makes it easier to ignore the consequences.
And some people just straight up blame the learner, like he's dumb, he deserves it.
It's dehumanizing. Makes it easier to be cruel if you think the other person is somehow less than you, less worthy.
So it's not just about personality. The whole situation, the authority figure, those gradual shocks, the distance from the victim, it all matters.
Huge influence. And that brings us to this chilling idea, the banality of evil. Milgram wasn't saying these people were evil. He was saying ordinary people can get sucked into doing awful things under the right circumstances.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if anyone, under the wrong circumstances, is capable of it. Like, it shakes your whole view of human nature.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what if we change the situation? What if the learner was right there in the room? What if other people were there objecting?
Milgram tested all that. He came up with a ton of variations to see how these different factors affected obedience.
And that's when things get really interesting. Even small changes, they can totally change how people react. Like when the learner was right there in the same room, obedience went way down. And when the teacher had to actually hold the learner's hand down on the shock plate, even fewer went through with it.
It makes sense, right? You can't ignore someone suffering when they're right there in front of you. That distance, that separation, makes it easier to detach from what you're doing.
Totally. We're wired for empathy, but out of sight, out of mind, right?
Milgram also messed with the authority figure. Like in one variation, he had two experimenters who started arguing about whether to continue. Almost nobody kept obeying when that happened.
Yeah, it's like seeing the cracks in the facade, the authority figures disagreeing. Suddenly you're not getting a unified message. It makes you think for yourself, is this really right?
So it's not just blind obedience. It's about believing the authority is legit. But what makes us think that? Is it a uniform? A fancy title?
Or is it something more? Like, do they seem to know what they're talking about? Do they seem trustworthy? I mean, think about it. This is something we all deal with, especially these days with so much information flying around. Who do you trust? Who do you listen to?
Who do you obey? It makes you think.
It takes real critical thinking. You can't just believe everything you hear, no matter how official it sounds. You got to look for evidence, think about motivations.
Milgram also found that one person speaking up could change everything. He added a couple more teachers to the mix, actors who refused to keep going, the real participants. way more likely to disobey too.
It's like a domino effect, right? Someone breaks the mold and boom, everyone else feels like they can too. Like it gives them permission.
So even little acts of defiance can matter. Speaking up, even if you think you're the only one, it can inspire other people. That's how real change happens.
And Milgram didn't stop at the lab. He looked at how modern society itself encourages obedience.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. We've got all these specialized jobs, big bureaucracies. Nobody feels fully responsible for anything. It's easy to distance yourself from the consequences.
Like I was just doing my job.
Exactly. So we're back to the banality of evil. It's not always about evil people. It's about systems, about structures that let people off the hook.
Chilling, really. Makes you think we need to pay attention not just to what we do, but to the systems we're part of.
Absolutely. Are we contributing to a culture of just blindly obeying? Are we enabling harmful things just by going along with the crowd?
So we've talked about what makes people obey and what makes them resist. But what can we actually do with this knowledge? How do we use it in our own lives?
Well, Milgram doesn't give us a simple answer. But his work gives us a place to start. First, pay attention. Notice when you feel pressure to conform, to obey, even when it feels icky.
Like those subtle cues, the language people use, the appeals to authority, the way dissent gets shut down. Once you see the patterns, you can start pushing back.
It's like learning how a magician does their tricks. Once you know the secret, it's not so impressive anymore.
So we need to be smarter about the information we take in, think critically, be aware of the forces that try to control us.
Exactly. And it's not just about information. It's about figuring out your own moral compass. What do you believe in? What are you willing to stand up for, even when it's hard?
And it's not enough to just think about it, talk about it, write about it, tell your friends.
Yeah, the more you express those values, the stronger they become, and the more courage you'll have to act on them when it matters.
And find your people. Find other people who get it, who share your concerns. It makes a huge difference having support. But someone has to be brave enough to speak up first.
Absolutely. And even small acts of resistance matter. You don't have to be a superhero. Sometimes just asking a question, expressing a doubt, saying no, that's enough to break the spell.
Milgram also talks about critical thinking skills. Being able to really evaluate information, see the biases, see through the BS, like being a smarter citizen.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Why am I doing this? What could happen? Is there another way? Sometimes just asking those questions can break that blind obedience and make you really think.
It's amazing how Milgram's work, it applies to so much more than just those experiments. Like we've been talking about authority in general, but you start thinking about specific places where this stuff happens every day.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like workplaces. How many times do you just go along with the company culture, even if you're not sure it's right? Or you follow orders from your boss, even when you have a bad feeling about it?
Or what about social media? We're constantly bombarded with messages. Influencers, algorithms, everyone's got an opinion. It's so easy to just get swept up in it and not even think for yourself.
That's what Milgram's research shows us. Obedience, it's not always a good thing. Sometimes you got to question, got to push back, got to say no when you know something's wrong.
It takes guts though, right? Especially when it's your boss or your friends telling you to just go along with it.
Oh, yeah, it does. And you know, Milgram even struggled with this in his own research. Some people got really upset during the experiment, even though they found out later it was all fake.
He did check up on them after, though, make sure they were okay. And he really pushed for strong ethical guidelines in research. He knew you can't just get knowledge at any cost.
Super important, especially when you're dealing with people. It's a tough question. Where do you draw the line? When are the results worth the risk?
Yeah, tough questions.
Yeah.
But we got to ask them.
So Milgram was all about how the situation affects people, but he also looked at individuals. Why did some people obey while others, stood up to the experimenter?
People are complicated. So many things go into why we do what we do.
Oh, yeah, totally. There's no easy answer. But Milgram, he noticed some interesting things. Like people with a strong sense of responsibility, they were more likely to disobey. They didn't want to just pass the buck.
So knowing you're in control, that you're the one making the choices that helps you resist.
Seems like it. And people who were more empathetic, who really felt for the learner, they tended to disobey too. It's like their conscience just wouldn't let them ignore the pain.
Like they could see beyond the experiment, see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that gives me hope, Even with all this pressure to conform, we still have that ability to choose. We can choose to do what we think is right.
Well, we've covered a lot today. Milgram's work, it really makes you think. Sometimes it's kind of scary.
It definitely challenges what we think we know about people. But it also helps us understand, helps us see how obedience and defiance work. And hopefully, it helps us be more aware, more critical, more brave.
So here's something to think about. What kind of authority figures are in your life? And when you have to choose between doing what you're told and doing what you believe in, what will you do? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.